I'm very happy to have Sikivu Hutchinson with us today. She is one of my fellow Speaker Bureau speakers on the Speakers Bureau for Secular Student Alliance. In addition to that, she has a PhD in Performance Studies from New York University. She's taught women studies, social studies, urban studies, and education at UCLA. She's a writer and senior intergroup specialist for LA County Human Relations Commission. She's taught at the California Institute of the Arts and Western Washington University. She's the author of many books, including Imagining Transit, Race, Gender, and Transportation Politics in LA, and the book we have here tonight, Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Value Wars, which is available back there. I encourage all of us to buy a copy of that. She's published fiction, essays, critical theory and social text, California English, Black Asia Report, Free Inquiry, and American Atheist magazine. She's the editor of blackfemlens.org and a senior fellow for the Institute for Humanist Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce Sikivu Hutchinson.
Well, thank you. This late afternoon, it's good to see that everyone did survive the apocalypse. Nice to be in an enclave of San Francisco heathens. I'm from Southern California. And I'm going to talk a lot about the political turbulence that we're in this era of so-called post-racialism. I'm going to frame a lot of my comments on the intersection of humanism, public education, feminism, and social justice. So I'm going to read excerpts from Moral Combat, and I'm going to begin with a reflection on some of my musings about the cultural knowledge of my students, because I teach in South LA as a women's leadership mentoring program with African American and Latina young women. And these issues of the toxic political climate that we're in right now resonate quite deep in terms of their lived experiences, their sense of cultural capital, and their sense of self and identity in the so-called post-racial, colorblind, post-feminist era. In 1781, black and brown women and men founded the city of LA. And the so-called city without a history, legend has it that undocumented Anglos were the real OG illegals. A few years before, a new revolution in what it meant to be human unfolded on the opposite shore, the British colonies. My students know the romance of the American Revolution, but not the secret of Los Angeles. In the prison house of textbook history, they know each other as enslaved niggers and wetback interlopers. Growing up in the same neighborhood, elbow to elbow, cheek by jowl, they are taught to believe that Black and Latino culture can be distilled down to media stereotypes like get rich or die trying hip-hop and ghetto dysfunction, big Catholic families, and job stealing illegals. As kindergartners, they were taught to cite Pledge of Allegiance, a sacred chapter and verse, hand solemnly over heart, an homage to royal theft. Founding myths of heroic white men bootstrapping to liberty are intimately bound to their imagination of the classroom, to its rhythm of shrill discipline and stench of brown chalk, to a regime of time in which white supremacy and narratives of progress are the currency of American faith. Over the past few decades, progressive education reform activism has reshaped the dialogue about the so-called achievement gap in public schools. Culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogy that builds on the lived experiences, cultural knowledge, language, and worldviews of children of color has become a standard, but still controversial approach to addressing race and class disparities in education. Culturally relevant pedagogy rejects myths of meritocracy, colorblindness, and exceptionalism. At its most radical, it critiques institutional structures of racist power and control that render children of color invisible within mainstream curriculum and instruction. It is based on the view that the question of what it means to be moral, to be a citizen, and to be human is implicit within the politics of education. So how does cultural relevance relate to radical humanism? And what is at stake for Black atheist/humanism and so-called post-racial America? What is the connection between humanism and social justice in this so-called post-racial era? After President Obama's election, the mainstream media gives the concept of post-racialism as the new norm. There was much speculation about whether Black History Month, long commodified and domesticated as a quick and dirty way to pay homage to the other, was still relevant. Was it redundant now that we had an African-American first family in the White House and Tommy and Malia were the girls next door? But of course, no one ever called Bill Clinton backslapping, rib-eating, philandering, good old boy Bill Clinton a bone in the nose, bongo-playing savage, or the son of apes. And no one ever caricatured Hillary Clinton as an ape or a missing link. Yet these were, of course, some of the images that were recurring within mainstream media over the past couple of years. Images that underscore that we are still, to use the terms that Phil Hooks has coined, a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy that is not suddenly transformed into this post-racial, colorblind, exceptionalist utopia as per the wet dreams of the mainstream media. In fact, as we know, some white folks even woke up and staggered into the new dawn of an African-American president proclaimed that the end times were upon us. Sound familiar? That the dark clouds of apocalypse had descended, and that we need to take back our country. And some white liberal and even some white progressive pundits assess this backlash and does it a populist backlash. A populist backlash that was oddly and egregiously missing people of color. Instead of really dubbing this backlash as a black nationalist insurgency. So, public religion research has come out with this interesting survey, 2010 survey, that suggested that a majority of Americans believe that God has conferred the United States with a special destiny, a special place in history. And in speaking to a group of homeschoolers, the former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum coined it this way. You have been given a great gift in living in the greatest country in the history of the world, with that freedom, that equality, that exceptionalism is at stake right now. And we do not replace the current president. And certainly this notion that exceptionalism is under grave and egregious backlash is fueling the assault on public employee union rights, on undocumented immigrant rights, on family planning, on abortion rights, on the very notion and edifice that women have some right to self-determination, on health care reform, and the very notion of a social welfare safety net. And so according to the same public religion research survey, 75% of those who identify with the Tea Party believe that discrimination against whites is now just as pressing as that against so-called minorities. A majority of those who characterize themselves as Christian fundamentalist evangelicals believe this to be true. And there is yet another poll that just come out, conducted by researchers at Harvard and Tufts University, that indicates that now many whites believe that they are the victims, the targets of racism. That they are more impacted by racism than are people of color. So the question is, given this toxic and political climate, what does it mean to be an African-American feminist, humanist, and atheist? And how have race, gender, class, sexuality, and power shaped public morality? Well, I want to put this in some historical and intellectual context. In 1927, A. Philip Randolph, who many of you may be familiar with, is one of my free-thought heroes. He was a socialist, activist, organizer, and also a humanist. So Randolph was the editor and publisher of an influential journal called Messenger. And he spawned this interesting essay writing concept called "Is Christianity a Menace to the Negro?" And it ended in 1927. And it's a concept and a theme that is really staggeringly unfathomable in this era of black hyper-religiosity and American prayer cult nation hysteria. But this was a period in which there were, quote-unquote, commies working behind every bill, and it was better to be this than red. Political radicals were associated with godlessness, and vice versa. And Randolph was constantly under attack and investigation for his so-called politically seditious activities. Also during this period, the writer Nella Larson in 1928 publishes her landmark work, Quicksand. And Quicksand was one of the first explicitly skeptic black feminist critiques of the cycling gender norms of the black church. And the novel is resonant because the protagonist is not only openly disdainful of organized religion, she's a biracial young woman, but she's grappling with issues of self-identity, self-esteem, shuttling back and forth between two very disparate worlds, that of Harlem of 1920s, Harlem Renaissance era, predominantly African American, and Copenhagen, Denmark, which is the country of her mother's origin. And so in one particularly vivid passage, Helga decries, she's the protagonist of Quicksand, Helga decries the absurdity of black slaves' devotion to, quote, the white man's God. She says that religion blunted the conceptions that robbed life of its root of truth. Religion especially had its uses for the poor, for the black. The white man's God must laugh at the great joke he played on them, bound them to slavery, into poverty and insult, and made them bear it. And so Larson's critique encapsulates many of the issues that the young Randolph, as an emerging organizer, humanist, and intellectual, grappled with early on in his career. But Randolph was effectively forced to downplay the secularism in light of the realities of the era. And the realities of the era were that African Americans, of course, were systematically excluded from white-dominated political, social, and economic institutions. And Randolph went on to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is one of the most influential African American trade unions in American history. And Randolph and his PSPP operatives and organizers worked very strenuously to establish ties with the black faith community, but were initially met with skepticism and resistance because the more conservative congregations within the black faith community viewed the PSPP as a threat. They were aligned with the Pullman Company, which had its own union. They were suspicious of the very trajectory of American trade unionism because it was very white supremacist and racist, particularly the American Federation of Labor during this period, 1920s into the 1940s. And they had been propagandized by the Pullman Company on the alleged godlessness and communism of the BSCP. Randolph and his organizers were portrayed as bomb-throwing godless communists, and some historians have speculated that as a result, Randolph retreated from his more radical posture on what he perceived to be the perniciousness of organized religion to black radicalism and black political mobilization. So that has always been the foundation for a seminal African-American humanism and social justice organizing. This connection between the institution of organized religion, economic injustice, capitalism, and the degree to which African-Americans have internalized white supremacist and racist perceptions of self-subjectivity and community. And Randolph was part of the vanguard of African-American free thinkers who espoused secular humanist principles, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an ardent critic of American imperialism and colonialism and Christian missionary incursions into the so-called Third World. James Forman, who was the one-time head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was also a very impassioned critic of American imperialist and colonialist policies, in addition to being a very frontal critic of black religious hypocrisy and the emerging class of black prosperity gospel preachers. The writers Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and Richard Wright all incorporated themes of free thought and secular discourse into their nonfiction and fiction, in addition to this criticism of black investment in the theme of redemptive suffering and the degree to which this investment in redemptive suffering effectively undermine black political radicalism and black political mobilization. Zora Hurston was also another founding black feminist freethinker who really delved into the perniciousness of her upbringing in the black church, vis-a-vis her identity as a black woman, freethinker, an intellectual, and someone who embraced critical thought, both within her fiction and nonfiction. So fast forward into the 21st century, and there are no prominent African Americans who have been willing to assume the mantle of secularism, much less humanism or atheism. And this is part and parcel of a climate of political hysteria that has been strategically cultivated by the far-right reactionary attack dogs of the Fox regime, from Michelle Bachmann and Winbeck, Newt Gingrich, the medievalist Sarah Palin, have all sought to connect politically liberal public policies with godlessness and anti-Americanism, healthcare reform as somehow being the font of socialism and communism. And Newt Gingrich has even gone so far as to claim that Obama is the architect of the so-called secular socialist machine, which on the face of it is patently absurd because Obama is very corporate identified, very conservative, very publicly Christian identified in his rhetoric. But the subtext of this critique, this diatribe against Obama, is really a demonization of his quote-unquote racial otherness. Because it doesn't matter how much of an uber Christian Obama portrays himself as. It doesn't matter how much he cozies up to homophobe evangelicals like Rick Warren, or cites scripture quite eloquently in his public addresses, or greenlights the most toxic aspect of Bush's faith-based initiative regime. He will never ever be Christian enough for the white heartland. He'll never be secular American enough for the birther Confederate racist reactionary. And he'll never ever be white enough to pass because within the white supremacist cultural logic of American ideology, one drop of your black appearing person walking down the street here in San Francisco or in Oakland or in Watts or in Detroit or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one drop still makes you whole. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not the U.S. is a Christian nation. And this whole idea of the U.S. being a Christian nation has a very specific racial provenance. And I was reminded of that when I did a series of teacher training workshops in one of the schools that I work at. And this particular school is located in a predominantly black and brown community that's a very high dropout rate, a low four-year college going rate, has been rightly stereotyped and caricatured in the mainstream media as a repository for decades. It still has, obviously, a lot of students who are exceeding and excelling despite these caricatures and stereotypes. And so during one session, two teachers got into an exchange about whether or not the U.S. is a Christian nation. And an African-American teacher who is very publicly Christian identified, very devout, defended the view that the U.S. is a Christian nation, while one of her white male colleagues, who is notorious for making racist and paternalistic comments about the predominantly black and brown student population at the school, staunchly defended the view that the U.S. has always been steeped in the separation of church and state and loudly proclaimed his non-belief. And while this conflict was raging, I was acutely aware of the very particular racial nuances of privilege when it comes to proclaiming one's non-belief in a public context. The fact that you can be the most disreputable white non-believer and not suffer any real racial consequences. Maybe some political consequences, but not racial consequences. That you would never, as a disreputable white non-believer, surrender your claim to universal status, to being considered a person, to being considered human. And that has been the rub and the paradox for black non-believers throughout American history. the fact that Christianity has been a de facto gateway to being considered to be human, person, and moral. And that there's been really no more profound performance of Americana, no more profound initiation into personhood in a United States context than that old-time Christian religion. During the height of the Jim Crow era, you have white children getting an initiation into the nexus of American justice, and that old-time Christian religion. You have old congregations, symbols, and figure pastors, and binoculars to watch public rituals, like they were here in conformity arts and sports. And this was an initiation, education into what it meant to be white and free. Because families that prayed and lived together stayed together. I recently read a short story by Alice Walker, who was a humanist, womanist activist. It was written in the 1970s, and it's called The Flowers. And in this story, she evokes the horror of a young African-American girl innocently out picking flowers who discovers the decomposing corpse of a lynching victim. In a very simple and eloquent prose, the short story is all 2 pages long. She highlights the contradictions of a nation that has always claimed to be the exemplar of democracy and inalienable rights and freedom, in essence of exceptionalism, but has done so through the erasure of this legacy of racial terrorism and disenfranchisement. And so the story ends with a simple parting salvo, and then the summer was over. Very eloquent, very powerful, and it is an allusion not just to the figurative end of summer, but to the end of the very possibility of innocence for this black child. Underscoring that to be a black child at any stage in America's exceptionalist history is to always already be othered, pathologized, embodied, racialized, and ultimately criminalized. Underscoring what the writer Michelle Alexander has termed the new Jim Crow. The fact that my students, the majority of them, will have a greater opportunity to be cycled through the school-to-prison pipeline in and out of juvenile detention facilities than they will to go on to a 4-year college and university. It also underscores the paradox of femininity for young black girls. The fact that to be a black girl in America is never, ever to occupy a space of preciousness or beauty or proper femininity. It's never, ever to occupy a space, a precious space in this culture, where you might find yourself being privileged in a national campaign around missing white women, which seems to be the mainstream media's propagandistic fixation. And so Walker's story and this whole notion of trying to underscore the connection between radical humanism and social justice is really one in which it's important to be critically conscious of the paradoxes of post, the paradoxes of the fact that this is a so-called post-feminist era in which greater numbers of young women are going on to colleges and universities, are enjoying these supposedly bountiful opportunities, but are still, particularly for young women of color, when they open up a textbook or they go to a Hollywood film or they see any kind of advertising campaign that focuses on gender, subtextually gender politics, is still to be in this position where they are being socialized to question, marginalize, and devalue themselves, where they are being indoctrinated into the belief that their ultimate social worth lies in being attractive and desirable to a man, where they're being shown that caregiving is really their authentic destiny, not moving on to colleges and careers and exercising some degree of self-determination.
And caregiving is only something that women of color should be shouldering, that men and boys don't have any responsibility when it comes to showing nurturing and caregiving. And so if there's been so much post-feminist progress, where are the alternative models of masculinity in American culture? The paradigm shift whereby male sexuality is just as coveted and valuable a commodity as female sexuality. Why hasn't a culture of male caregiving and anti-violence emerged? Where's the liberated universe where women and girls can walk down the street, walk down the halls of school, or go to sleep in their own beds without fear of assault? Good women accept that violence against women is just a way of life. Male saviors bent on retribution and divine justice mandated. The biblical notion of original sin outlined in Genesis is crucial to the social control of women. The inherent fallibility/evil of women is especially insidious for African American women because of the dominant culture's racist, misogynistic representation of women of color. Under slavery, black women were constructed as hypersexual and promiscuous, the antithesis of virginal white femininity. White femininity signified the pinnacle of European civilization, liberalism, and morality. Because African American women were mired in a backward, savage culture, black femininity was perceived as the polar opposite of white womanhood. White womanhood symbolized all the virtues and cultural/aesthetic achievement of the so-called new nation. And the idea of degraded African American femininity is central to the American national ideal because it affirms the essential moral and cultural superiority of European American democracy. And so there's been a lot of talk about the so-called war on women. But I would posit that this war on women, particularly women of color, has always been part of the American national and imperial project in the United States. And that the war on women is, yes, reflected on the fact that there is backlash against family planning, against abortion rights, against the very notion of gender justice. But it's also subtly reflected in the fact that mainstream social justice organizations, and I include humanist organizations within that, do not hold issues like intimate partner violence and reproductive justice in high enough esteem where they would be significant causes for national mobilization. And this despite the fact that women of color and white working class women disproportionately rely on family planning preventive services. And in many instances, particularly for women of color, particularly for African American women, are the disproportionate primary breadwinners in their families and are disproportionately impacted by intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And so in their silence around these issues, mainstream social justice organizations, particularly those of color, are effectively complicit with the draconian agenda of the black religious right that says that women of color should surrender their bodies, their destinies, their right to self-determination in service to the very narrow and reductive notion of patriarchy and heterosexual families and masculinist organizations of inner-city communities. And says that, too, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks of African descent should remain closeted, silenced, and marginalized when it comes to the overall arc of black liberation struggle. And many of these tensions are reflected in this national abortion and black genocide campaign that has emerged over the past year and a half, and that has been targeted for primarily black and brown, quote-unquote, inner-city communities. And the narrative is that black women who get abortions are somehow contributing to genocidal slaughter of black children. And this particular campaign, which has been launched by primarily white religious right in terms of funding, in league with the black religious right in terms of church campaigns and organizations. This campaign evokes the worst, most reductive caricatures of black femininity and black sexuality, basically reducing black women to plantation-era breeders and suggesting that black women who do not surrender their bodies and their right to self-determination in service to this monolithic masculine notion of black families are essentially race traitors and gender apostates. And so this issue of black women being the battleground for this new theocratic morality is something that is very critical for a humanist notion of social justice and a humanist notion of political organizing around radical politics. In this post-racial era, the myth of colorblindness seeks to basically obliterate the contemporary implications of these legacies. Again, this nexus of plantation-era stereotypes and social constructions of race and gender and the contemporary resonances that we see manifest in very far-right reactionary public policy. It makes inequality and racism appear to be an aberration. It transforms racism and inequality into embarrassing faux pas that the U.S. evolved out of. Yet in this Christian colorblind, up by our bootstrapped nation, the reality of residential segregation, of race-based achievement gaps in education, and race-based gaps in income, assets, and wealth, which are staggering between white families and African-American families, for example. Mainstream media representation that is egregiously racist and white supremacist when it comes to depictions of blacks and Latinos. All of these dynamics underscore the lie of this rosy post-racial representation. And so a humanist morality based on social justice goes beyond this very narrow and, in my mind, reductive deconstruction and fixation on religion. It should expose the structures of oppression that promote religion as an enterprise, an instrumental enterprise, particularly within black and brown disenfranchised communities. It should go beyond mere tolerance and kumbaya notions of diversity towards the articulation of agrarian critical consciousness. And it should be ultimately based on the view that racism is not just a problem of people of color, but it is American as baseball, apple pie, and in God we trust. Racism is an integral part, really, of what it means to be a white American citizen in a 21st century global context in which white children are now growing up with this paradox of seeing Sasha and Malia scampering on the White House lawn. Many of you may be familiar with the doll test, which was conducted in the late 1940s. Is anyone familiar with that? It's called the doll test. Okay. So the doll test was conducted by African-American researchers, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. And it was done to assess the self-esteem and self-identity of very young black children. And they basically presented these children with a white doll and a black doll and asked them a series of questions. Asked them to identify which doll was the most intelligent, the most attractive, the most desirable, and the doll that resembled them the most. And the pivotal finding of this experiment was that African-American children were overwhelmingly identifying the white doll as being the one that had the most positive attributes, and tragically being the one that resembled them the most. And so the doll test was revisited in 2010. Some of you may have seen the CNN profile that was done. A researcher that was hired by CNN recreated the test, this time using white and black children, and showing the white and black children from pre-K into middle school a series of images, a spectrum of white-appearing children and black-appearing children. And the white children overwhelmingly identified the white-appearing images as being the images that were most attractive, were most desirable, were the nicest, and were the images that both adults and children most favored. And so in a follow-up discussion about the implications of this test, one of the white parents whose child was involved expressed her frustration and dismay at her child's response, because her child was one of the children who identified the white images as being most positive, attractive, intelligent, what have you. And so she stated that she didn't understand why her child made these selections, because in her household, they had an emphasis on colorblindness. There was no talk about race. She was mystified. But many researchers have concluded that white households that emphasize a colorblind approach, where there is no discourse around racial difference, actually predispose their children to being more prejudiced towards people of color. And how can it not be so? When again, if they are opening up a textbook, if they are turning on the TV, if they are going on to watch a Hollywood film, if they are looking at C-SPAN as white children, they're seeing themselves represented as heroes, as authority figures, as romantic figures, as those who are really leading the charge in terms of all aspects of decision making. And this is part of what W.E.B. Du Bois has termed the wages of whiteness, the public and psychological wages conferred upon white people, regardless of class status, as a kind of de facto class status. Whiteness, in essence, is a moral category, a priori, universal, normal. And so in closing, I want to read a passage that encapsulates some of the concerns that Black feminists, atheists, humanists have with the arc of the European and European-American dominated new atheist movement. In 2009, when I went to speak at the Atheist Alliance International Convention in Burbank, I was approached by a white man who proceeded to tell me in a hushed, confidential tone that religion was the primary cause of intimate partner violence among African Americans. And it was a tragedy that more blacks didn't realize it. He was clearly an expert on all things black, because he's taken black history classes in college, a tidbit that he revealed in part. After the exchange, I resisted temptation to approach random white people and inform them that if, quote, your kind stop practicing evangelical Christianity, there will be fewer out-of-wedlock births among you white people. This is why the new atheist science and reason, as Matthew Bullitt's stick, is reductive. Atheist humanists of color have a broader mandate because many see intimate partner violence as connected to conditions of sex suppression in the dominant culture, as well as black patriarchy and economic injustice. Further, the social construction of black women as greater than others is crucial to the articulation of scientific discovery. For example, in the 1950s, the cancerous cells of a black woman named Henrietta Lacks were used to develop polio vaccination, advanced cancer research, and numerous other medical cures. Lacks' case was a legacy of a long history of scientific racism dating back to the use of black women's bodies for slave-era experimentation. So constructing the racial and sexual other to define what is human is as much a part of the legacy of Western rationalism as individual liberty. Science without social justice can be dangerous. Progressive or radical humanism without insight into America's apartheid history is an oxymoron. And the Flower Girl and Alice Walker's Lovely Fields bore witness to the special savagery of American justice, where, quote, due process meant the bullet and the bullwhip. And without a radical progressive vision of humanism, it will continue to be so. Thank you.